today I want to talk about the differences between a DC layout and a DCC layout. How do they behave? This isn't going to be an electrical engineering course, don't worry. But as I've said before, a DCC track is actually AC voltage with a digital signal going through it. DC, that we're accustomed to from years ago, and still prevalent, is literally DC on and off. So you change the direction of your engine by changing the polarity of the track, and that's what these transformers do for us out of the box. So in DCC, there's intelligence within each engine at the decoder, and there's intelligence at the controller. With DC, again, it was just DC voltage going along the track. You want the engine to go faster, you turn up the voltage. You want it to go slower, turn down the voltage. You want to change directions, change polarity of the voltage. That was it. So let's get into it. I want to show you the voltages on the track while we're doing our experiments. So I've hooked up this multimeter and it's recording DC voltage. It says DC right by my thumb. This multimeter is recording AC voltage. They're both connected to the same track. And what this lets us do is look at voltages on the track as we drive trains. Now we're looking at 951 and as we drive 951. And as you'll notice, the voltages flicker, but basically stay the same. On DC, it's a different story, and I will show that to you here in a minute. But my point to this is with DCC, the track voltage always remains constant. The decoder's job is to hear signals addressed to that particular decoder in that particular engine, and then take action based on what it's asked to do. It then converts that AC voltage that we're seeing here to the DC voltage that drives the DC motor. Now, I'm going to trade out my two DCC engines for two DC engines, and we'll play with that here next. Now, the fun part is I've got two DC locomotives. I want to point out this DC locomotive because it was a DCC converted locomotive. Lots of wires, right? And I had this thought, how could I convert a decoder installed locomotive back to just straight DC? And it's primarily for this experiment. So the cool thing about Digitrax is a lot of their decoders have these plugs. So literally the decoder plugs in right here where this gray and orange wire are. So in the schematics of the Digitrax decoder, when they say solder the red and black wires to track pickups and the orange and gray wires to the motor, all I've done is taken two wires now and jumpered between the black and the gray and the orange and the red. This gives me the same behavior as when it was wired for straight DC. The frustrating part was because I had lights enabled as well, I had to cut 3 wires to make this happen. But it's a small trade-off, right? Because what this does is gives us the ability to see two DC engines move on the track at the same time. Now the fun part, I'm going to leave this selected at 951 for a moment, and I'm going to watch my meters. When I turn up the throttle, nothing happens on the DC meter. The AC meter just fluctuates like it's been doing. So when I go back over here to the controller and now select engine 0, which engine 0 is the magic number telling the controller we're going to talk to a DC or multiple DC engines. When I turn the controller on and tell the engines to go, both engines go forward, and when I stop, both engines will now go backwards. So with DC, we have that issue of all of our engines run at the same time. Now what people did as they built their DC tracks was they would separate, kind of like I have here, the power between, say, the outer rail and the inner rail. And then they would use a separate controller that would drive the inner rail. And that's really cool because I used to really have controller jealousy over those that had multiple controls so they could drive more than one train on more than one set of tracks. DCC solved that problem. When we set up our DCC engines in the same configuration, two engines, one in front of the other, the cool thing about DCC, as we've talked about, the last thing I want to do is show you my original DC track only transformer and measure the voltages as I turn that up. So I've moved my DC multimeter over to just this transformer. So as we look at the voltage, as I turn up the throttle, you'll see it jumps up to 20 volts. On the DCC controller, when we're at engine 0 and we go full throttle, we only see a top voltage of 7.5. So on a normal DC track, we give the engine up to 20 volts, gives it more speed, more power. But on a DCC track, it only gets 7 volts, which means it's not going to have as much speed or as much power because we're only a third of the way through its power curve from a DCC controller. So everybody says, yes, you can run DC on a DCC track. And technically they're correct. But they also say if you leave your DC engines, which now are sitting in the very back because I've been driving them around, if you leave your DC engines on a DCC track and that track is powered, which ours is not right now, you'll eventually burn out those motors. I'm not going to test that theory. My goal is to not run DC engines on my DCC track for long. When I get a new engine and it's DC, I'll put it on the track to make sure it runs before I convert it to DCC. I learned a long time ago, make sure it's working before you take it apart, because it's really frustrating if you take it apart, do all the work, come back and now it's not working. You don't know whether you broke it or it was broken coming in. That's my plan is I test them, just DC engine on DCC track, make sure it runs, and then once I'm sure it runs, then I go break it down, put the decoder in it, like I did in the prior video for the Union Pacifics, and then bring it back and run it again. So the other thing I want to point out is because I've got this DC transformer here, could I just hook that up to my track and run my track as DC? Technically, yes, but I'm not going to. And the reason is because I have automatic switches. So I've used tortoises and Smales and some other controllers. We'll talk about that later. But all of these are set up expecting DCC. If all of a sudden I throw DC voltage at them, I expect I will break something. So for me, I leave this track as DCC, convert the engines I want to convert to DCC, and enjoy life. Thanks for the time, and we'll talk again soon.